Death at the Regent's Theatre. Chapter 1. A Night at the Theatre. Inspector Price adjusted the collar of his overcoat as he stepped out of the bustling streets of London and into the grand entrance of the Regent's Theatre. The evening air was crisp, but the buzz of excitement outside the theatre kept the crowd warm as they waited for the highly anticipated opening night of The Last Curtain. The Regent's Theatre, known for its opulence and grandeur, had long been a favourite of London's elite. Tonight, it was a full house, and every seat was filled with members of society eager to witness the latest masterpiece by renowned playwright Henry Groves. Price was not the usual attendee of such events. His life as an inspector of Scotland Yard rarely allowed time for luxuries like the theatre, but he had been invited by one of the theatre's patrons to attend the opening night. More out of courtesy than enthusiasm, he had agreed, seeing it as a brief respite from his usual duties. The theatre foyer was a sea of silk gowns and polished suits, with the soft hum of conversation and the clinking of champagne glasses filling the air. Chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the crowd, their light reflected in the marble floors and ornate mirrors that adorned the walls. Price noted the opulence with a detached interest, his mind always half-focused on the world outside, where crime and chaos still reigned. As he made his way through the crowd, he caught sight of a familiar face. Sir Reginald Fordham, the theatre's wealthy patron, stood by the grand staircase, entertaining a small group of admirers. Sir Reginald was a stout man in his mid-50s, with thinning silver hair and a jovial demeanour that belied his shrewd business acumen. Price had met him several times before, always in the context of some charity event or social gathering, but tonight Sir Reginald seemed particularly engaged in his role as the benefactor of the arts. "Ah, Inspector Price," he boomed, spotting Price as he approached. "So glad you could make it. Quite the crowd tonight, wouldn't you say?" Price smiled politely, shaking Sir Reginald's hand. "It seems the whole of London has turned out for the occasion." The wealthy patron grinned, clearly pleased. "Indeed, it's all thanks to our leading man, Oliver Darrow. The man's a legend, you know. The audience practically worships him. I dare say this will be one of our finest productions yet." Price nodded, though he knew little of the world of theatre or its stars. Still, he had heard of Oliver Darrow, the charismatic actor whose performances had earned him a reputation as one of the finest in London. But behind the curtain, Price had heard other rumours. Darrow was said to be a difficult man, prone to arrogance and quarrels with his fellow actors. "I'm sure it will be a night to remember," the inspector replied. As he continued his conversation with Sir Reginald, Price's eyes wandered across the room. He noticed a tall woman standing near the edge of the crowd, her dark eyes scanning the room with the same keen observation that Price himself possessed. Her raven-black hair was swept up into an elaborate style, and her emerald gown clung to her figure with effortless grace. She was strikingly beautiful, but her expression was cold and distant, as though she were merely a spectator in her own world. "That's Madame Elise Dupont," Sir Reginald said, following Price's gaze. "Once the brightest star in this theatre, but times change. She's been relegated to a secondary role in tonight's performance, much to her dismay." Price raised an eyebrow. "Relegated? Why?" Sir Reginald sighed, lowering his voice. "Elise used to be the theatre's leading lady, but her time has passed. Oliver Darrow, he's the star now. She's bitter about it, of course. She and Oliver, well, let's just say they've had their differences." Price watched as Elise Dupont's gaze briefly flickered toward Sir Reginald before she turned and disappeared into the crowd. There was something about her demeanour, cool, controlled, but with an undercurrent of anger, that caught the inspector's attention. A woman scorned, perhaps by the rise of a younger, more popular actor. "Differences?" he asked, curious. Sir Reginald gave a short laugh. "That's putting it mildly. They were lovers once, but that ended in flames, as such things often do. Now they can barely stand to be in the same room. She's clinging to what's left of her career. And Oliver is always looking out for himself. Speaking of Oliver, Sir Reginald continued, glancing toward the grand staircase. There he is now. Price turned to see Oliver Darrow descending the staircase, his presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. Tall and handsome, with a mane of dark hair and a perfectly tailored suit, Oliver moved with the confidence of a man who knew he was admired. The crowd parted for him as he made his way toward the stage, a knowing smirk playing on his lips as he acknowledged the whispers and stares that followed him. He studied the man closely. There was an arrogance in his stride, a sense of entitlement that often accompanied men who were used to getting what they wanted. But there was also something else, something darker. "Quite the presence, isn't he?" Sir Reginald remarked, watching Oliver with a mixture of admiration and unease. "He's what keeps this theatre alive, but he's also a difficult man. The cast can't stand him, most of them anyway." "Why's that?" Price asked, already guessing the answer. Sir Reginald sighed, lowering his voice. "He's ruthless, Inspector. Charming on stage, but a tyrant behind the scenes. He manipulates people, especially the younger actors, promises them roles, then takes them away if they don't play by his rules. He's had his fair share of enemies, let me tell you, but he's good for business, so the theatre overlooks his behaviour." Before he could ask more, the lights flickered, signalling that the performance was about to begin. Sir Reginald excused himself, and Price made his way to his seat in the front row, his mind already working through the various dynamics at play. The orchestra began to play, and the audience fell silent as the stage lit up with the opening scene of The Last Curtain. Price watched as Oliver Darrow took centre stage, his commanding presence captivating the audience. The first half of the play passed without incident, and during the intermission, Price rose from his seat to stretch his legs. He was about to make his way to the foyer when a commotion near the stage caught his attention. A stagehand, his face pale with panic, burst through the curtains, his eyes wide with fear. "Help! Someone get help!" the stagehand cried, his voice trembling. "Oliver Darrow! He's dead!" The audience gasped, and within seconds, the theatre descended into chaos. Price pushed through the crowd, making his way toward the stage. As he reached the backstage area, the gravity of the situation became clear. Oliver Darrow lay slumped in a chair, his face pale and his lips tinged with blue. The faint scent of bitter almonds lingered in the air, and Price immediately recognized the signs of poisoning. This was no accident. This was murder, and it was up to Inspector Price to find out who and why. Chapter 2. The First Investigation. The once vibrant theatre had been transformed into a scene of chaos. The crowd that had filled the lavish auditorium with laughter and excitement was now gripped by fear and confusion. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the aisles as audience craned their necks to catch a glimpse of what was happening backstage. The buzz of excited chatter from earlier had been replaced by anxious whispers, and the growing realization that Oliver Darrow, the star of the night, was dead sent waves of panic through the theatre. Price crouched beside the body, careful not to disturb the scene. His sharp eyes took in every detail, the cup in Oliver's hand, the untouched props nearby, and the goblet of wine that lay overturned on the small table beside him. A fine, dark liquid pooled on the table and dripped slowly to the floor. Price dipped his finger into the liquid and sniffed it cautiously, confirming his initial suspicion. The wine had been poisoned, and Oliver had most likely ingested it just before his final scene. As the inspector rose to his feet, a figure appeared in the doorway. Sir Reginald Fordham, his normally jovial face drained of colour. His round eyes darted from the body to Price, his hand gripping the doorframe as though he might collapse at any moment. "Inspector!" "This is terrible," Sir Reginald stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't understand. Who could have done this?" Price held Sir Reginald's gaze for a moment, studying his reaction. There was genuine shock in the man's expression. "Who else has access to this room?" he asked, his tone brisk and professional as he moved past Sir Reginald and into the narrow corridor that led deeper into the backstage area. "I need to know who was near Oliver in the moments before the performance." Sir Reginald shook his head, still struggling to process the scene. "The dressing room is only used by the lead actors, but the cast and crew move freely backstage during the show. Anyone could have come through here." This meant there were several people who might have had the opportunity to poison Oliver, but the question of motive loomed large. Oliver Darrow had been the undisputed star of the theatre, but his reputation for arrogance and cruelty had made him a polarizing figure among his peers. That much Price had already gathered from his brief conversations before the performance, but now he needed answers, and quickly. "Keep the audience in their seats for now," Price instructed. "I'll need to interview the cast and crew immediately." Sir Reginald nodded shakily and disappeared to ensure that the theatre staff carried out the inspector's orders. Price turned back to Oliver's lifeless body. The poisoned goblet was the most obvious clue, but the method suggested premeditation. Someone had planned this carefully. Oliver had been murdered during one of the most high-profile performances of the season, in front of London's elite. Whoever the killer was, they had intended to make a statement. As he straightened, his thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Madame Elise Dupont. She swept into the room, her emerald gown swishing against the floor, and her sharp, dark eyes immediately fixed on Oliver's body. For a moment she seemed frozen, staring at the man who had once been her lover. Then, as if regaining her composure, she turned to Price, her voice cold and steady. "I heard the commotion," she said, her voice barely betraying any emotion. "Is it true? Is Oliver dead?" Price nodded, watching her carefully. "He's been poisoned, Madame Dupont. I'm afraid this is now a matter of murder." Elise's face remained impassive, but her hands clenched at her sides, a subtle sign of tension that Price did not miss. She stepped closer to the body, her gaze flicking to the poisoned goblet on the table. "Oliver had many enemies," she said softly. "He made no effort to hide his disdain for those around him. It was only a matter of time before someone sought revenge." Price raised an eyebrow, intrigued by her calmness. "And you, Madame Dupont? You were once close to him. Did you consider him an enemy?" Elise's lips curled into a bitter smile, though it never reached her eyes. "Enemy? No. He was far too small a man to be considered my enemy. He was merely an obstacle." "An obstacle to what?" Price asked, sensing that there was more to her story. "To my career, Inspector," Elise replied coolly. "I was once the leading lady of this theatre. I ruled the stage and the audience adored me. But when Oliver came along, everything changed. He manipulated his way into the spotlight, and I was cast aside. My talents were no longer appreciated, so I left him. And the stage." She paused, her gaze hardening as she looked down at Oliver's body. "If you're asking if I had reason to hate him, the answer is yes. But murder, that's not how I deal with my problems." The inspector nodded, but he wasn't entirely convinced. Elise Dupont was a master of control, both on and off the stage, and it was clear that her relationship with Oliver had left her with deep wounds. But had those wounds festered into murder? Before he could press any further, Henry Groves, the playwright, entered the room, his face pale and drawn. His thin frame seemed even more gaunt than usual, and he was wringing his hands nervously as he approached. "This is unthinkable," Groves muttered, his voice trembling. "Oliver? Dead? It can't be." Price turned to the playwright, noting the man's anxious demeanor. "Mr. Groves, you worked closely with Oliver on this production, didn't you?" Groves nodded, still staring at the body in disbelief. "Yes, but it wasn't easy. Oliver had a way of making things difficult for everyone. He wanted to rewrite entire sections of the play, change his lines, dominate the stage. He thought he knew better than me, than anyone. We argued constantly, but I never..." I would never harm him. Price's sharp eyes narrowed. You argued often then. Did it ever get physical? Groves shook his head quickly, his eyes widening in alarm. No, nothing like that. It was just creative differences. But Oliver was relentless. He was determined to control every aspect of the production and, well, it's no secret that many of us resented him for it. As Price weighed Groves's words, the door to the dressing room creaked open again, and Abigail Trent entered hesitantly. The young understudy looked as though she had seen a ghost, her face pale and her hands trembling as she stood near the doorway, her wide eyes fixed on Oliver's body. Is it true? She whispered, her voice shaking. Oliver, is he really dead? Price nodded, studying her reaction closely. Abigail was a talented but inexperienced actress who had been trying to make a name for herself in a competitive theatre world. She had idolized Oliver at first, but from what Price had gathered, their relationship had soured in recent months. I'm afraid so, he replied calmly. Oliver Darrow has been poisoned. Did you see anything unusual before the performance? Abigail shook her head quickly, her eyes brimming with tears. No, I didn't see anything. I was in the wings, waiting for my cue, but I didn't know. How could this happen? The inspector sensed genuine fear in Abigail's voice, but he couldn't ignore the ambition that had driven her to the theatre in the first place. She had stood in Oliver's shadow for too long, and it was no secret that she had wanted to take his place as the lead. Could that ambition have driven her to murder? Each of these people had a reason to want Oliver dead, but which of them had the means and the opportunity to commit the crime? He turned to the group, his expression stern. I'll need to question each of you further, but for now, no one is to leave the theatre. The audience will be kept in place until I have the chance to speak with them as well. If any of you know something, now is the time to tell me. There was no response, only the flickering of the gas lamp and the uneasy silence that followed his words. The inspector left the dressing room to begin his interview. A man had been murdered, and the killer was still within the walls of the theatre. Chapter 3. The Secrets of the Theatre. The scent of bitter almonds and death still hung in the air as Inspector Albert Price left Oliver Darrow's dressing room. The once bustling theatre had grown eerily quiet, with the stunned audience confined to their seats and the cast and crew hovering in the wings, unsure of what to do. Price knew the world of the theatre was filled with ambition, vanity, and old grudges, qualities that bred resentment and, as tonight had shown, could lead to murder. As he made his way backstage, his thoughts churned. Oliver Darrow had been poisoned, and everyone he had spoken to so far had both a reason to hate him and the opportunity to administer the poison. The goblet that Oliver had used during the performance had been a prop, but it was likely that it had been tampered with before the play began. The question was, by whom? He entered the wings, where the cast and crew had gathered in tense silence. They huddled in small groups, whispering amongst themselves, their faces pale with fear and uncertainty. He approached Henry Groves, the playwright. Mr. Groves, Price said, I'd like to ask you a few more questions. Henry Groves looked up sharply, his face even paler than before. He nodded quickly, as if afraid to speak. Price gestured for him to follow, and they moved to a quieter corner of the backstage area. Tell me more about your relationship with Oliver Darrow, Price began, his tone steady but firm. You mentioned that you had creative differences, but from what I've gathered, your conflicts went deeper than that. Groves swallowed hard, avoiding Price's gaze. It's true, Inspector. Oliver and we never saw eye to eye. He was a brilliant actor, but he was also insufferable. He had no respect for my work. He wanted to change everything. Rewrite scenes, add his own lines, even alter the ending. It was infuriating. I poured my heart into this play, and he treated it like his personal playground. Price nodded, sensing there was more. You argued frequently? Groves hesitated before answering. Yes, almost every day. He was always pushing me, always trying to undermine my authority as the playwright. But that doesn't mean I would kill him, Inspector. As much as I hated his arrogance, I couldn't do something like that. Price studied Groves's face. The playwright's frustration with Oliver was evident, but his nervousness seemed more like fear than guilt. "And what about the props?" the inspector asked, shifting the conversation. "Who handles the goblets used during the performance?" Groves blinked, as if startled by the change in topic. "The props are managed by the stagehands, but the actors themselves handle them during the show. Oliver always insisted on inspecting his own props before going on stage. He said it helped him get into character." Price's brow furrowed. "So Oliver would have handled the goblet before the performance?" Groves nodded. "Yes. He would have checked it himself. That's why it's so strange. How could someone have poisoned him without his knowledge?" Price considered this carefully. If Oliver had inspected the goblet before going on stage, then the poison must have been administered at the last possible moment. That narrowed the window of opportunity, but it also made the crime more audacious. The inspector dismissed Groves for the moment, instructing him to stay nearby, and made his way over to Madame Elise Dupont, who stood by the curtain, her arms crossed and her expression icy. She had been calm earlier, almost too calm, and Price couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something. "Madame Dupont," Price began, his tone a touch softer than before, "I need to understand more about your relationship with Oliver. You said earlier that he was an obstacle to your career. What did you mean by that?" Elise's dark eyes flickered with a hint of bitterness as she met Price's gaze. "You misunderstand, Inspector. Oliver wasn't just an obstacle. He was a thief. He stole the spotlight from me, took what was rightfully mine. I built my career on this stage. I was the star. But when Oliver came along, everything changed. Suddenly, the theatre was all about him, and I was pushed aside." Her voice, though controlled, carried a sharp edge of resentment. Price sensed that her words held more than professional frustration. There was personal pain buried beneath the surface. "You were once lovers," Price stated, watching her closely for a reaction. Elise's expression didn't change, though her lips tightened slightly. "Yes, years ago, but that ended a long time ago. Oliver and we were toxic together. He used me, manipulated me, and then discarded me when I was no longer useful to him." "And you never forgave him for that?" Price asked. Elise's eyes darkened. "I don't forgive easily, Inspector, but I moved on. Oliver was always going to destroy himself in the end. He didn't need my help." Before he could ask more, a commotion near the wings drew his attention. Abigail Trent, the young understudy, was standing near the stage, her face pale and her hands trembling, as she argued with one of the stagehands. "I swear I didn't touch it," Abigail cried, her voice rising in panic. "I never even went near it." Inspector Price moved quickly toward the scene, his sharp eyes zeroing in on the source of the argument. The stagehand, a burly man with a nervous expression, was holding the goblet that had been used during the performance, the very same goblet that had been poisoned. "What's going on here?" Price demanded, his voice cutting through the chaos. The stagehand, clearly shaken, glanced between Price and Abigail. I found the goblet backstage, right after the performance ended. I was cleaning up the props when I noticed it had been left out. Abigail was standing nearby, and when I asked her about it, she denied touching it." Price's eyes narrowed as he turned to Abigail. The young actress looked terrified, her hands still trembling as she stared at the goblet. "Abigail," Price said calmly but firmly, "tell me exactly what happened." Abigail shook her head frantically, her voice trembling. "I didn't touch it, Inspector, I swear. I was in the wings waiting for my cue. But I never went near the goblet. I wouldn't do something like that." "You're the understudy, aren't you?" Price asked, his tone measured. "If something happened to Oliver, you'd be next in line to take the lead role." Abigail's eyes widened and she shook her head again. "No, Inspector, please. I didn't want anything to happen to Oliver. Yes, I wanted my chance to shine, but not like this, not through murder. The inspector held her gaze for a long moment, weighing her words. He could see the ambition in her, the desire to step into the spotlight, but was she capable of murder to achieve it? Or was someone else using her as a scapegoat? Before Price could continue, Sir Reginald Fordham reappeared, his face lined with worry. Inspector, the audience is becoming restless. They're starting to ask questions, and we've made them sit for too long. What should we do? Keep them in place for now, Price instructed, his tone firm. Tell them there's been an emergency, but don't give them any details. I'll address the crowd soon. Sir Reginald nodded and hurried off to relay the message, leaving Price once again with his suspects. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to come together, but he still needed more information. The poison, the goblet, the strained relationships between the cast and crew. Everything pointed to a carefully orchestrated murder. The inspector knew that the key to solving Oliver Darrow's murder lay not just in understanding who had the most to gain, but also who had the most to lose. Chapter 4: Poison and Paranoia. The scent of damp wood and old costumes permeated the backstage of the theatre. The lavishly adorned stage, now darkened, seemed like a world away from the tense atmosphere backstage. The poison, with its telltale almond scent, was most likely cyanide, fast-acting and lethal in small doses. Price knew he needed more information, more clarity, especially about the goblet itself. The prop had been handled by multiple people throughout the evening, yet no one had seen anything suspicious. His next stop was to speak to the stage manager and the prop master. These were the people who knew the mechanics of the theatre inside and out. If anyone could shed light on how the goblet might have been tampered with, it would be them. He found David Gibbons, the stage manager near the prop room. A wiry man with a thin moustache and nervous energy, Gibbons was pacing up and down the hallway, clearly unsettled by the night's events. When Price approached him, he stopped abruptly, wringing his hands as he spoke. "Inspector, this whole thing is a nightmare," Gibbons muttered, shaking his head. "I've been working in theatre for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like this. Oliver was difficult, but murder, who could have done this?" "That's what I intend to find out," Price replied calmly. "Tell me about the goblet that was used during the performance. Who handles the props, and how secure is that process?" Gibbons ran a hand through his thinning hair, thinking for a moment. "Well, the props are set by the crew in the afternoon, and we keep everything under lock and key in the prop room until the show starts. Only the prop master, Janet, and I have access to the room. Once the props are set on stage, the actors are responsible for handling them during their scenes." "So the goblet was brought out before the performance and remained on stage?" Price asked. Gibbons nodded. "That's right. It was placed on a table just off stage left, with the rest of the set pieces. The actors pick it up when they need it for their scenes." He considered this for a moment. If the poison had been added to the goblet before the performance, it would have been incredibly risky for the killer. Anyone could have noticed a foreign substance or a strange smell. But if the poison had been introduced during the performance, the killer would have needed precise timing and access to the stage without raising suspicion. "Did you notice anything unusual about the props before or during the show?" Price pressed. Gibbons shook his head. "No, nothing. Everything seemed normal. The props were where they were supposed to be, and no one reported anything missing or out of place." Price frowned, unsatisfied. The poison had been introduced somehow, but no one seemed to have noticed anything amiss. He needed to speak with Janet, the prop master, who might have more insight into the process. After a brief search, Price found Janet in the small, cluttered prop room. She was a middle-aged woman with greying hair and a stern expression, her hands busy organizing the chaos of props that filled the space. When Price entered, she looked up, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. "Inspector," she said, her voice brusque, "what can I do for you?" "I need to know more about the goblet that was used in the play," he said, How secure are the props during the show, and is it possible that someone could have tampered with the goblet before or during the performance? Janet set down the prop she was holding and crossed her arms. The props are secure as they can be in a theatre like this. We don't have Armitage vaults here, but we do our best. I personally inspect all the props before they go on stage. Nothing was out of place before the show started. And during the show, he asked, could someone have accessed the goblet without being noticed? Janet considered this for a moment, then shook her head. It's possible, I suppose, but not likely. There's always someone around. Actors, stagehands, crew members. Anyone sneaking onto the stage during a performance would risk being seen. He nodded thoughtfully. With no clear answers from the stage manager or the prop master, he decided to return to the suspects. One of them had to know more than they were letting on. As he made his way back to the dressing rooms, his thoughts turned to Madame Elise Dupont. Her demeanor earlier had been cold and controlled, but he couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something. Her bitterness toward Oliver was well known, and she had admitted to resenting him for taking the spotlight from her. He found Madame Dupont in her dressing room, sitting at the vanity and staring into the mirror, her reflection ghostly in the dim light. She didn't turn as Price entered, her eyes fixed on her own face, as though she were contemplating something far beyond her own image. Madame Dupont, Price said, his voice firm, I need to ask you a few more questions. Elise finally turned to face him. More questions, Inspector. What more could I possibly tell you? Price closed the door behind him and approached slowly. I need to understand what happened before the performance. You said earlier that you and Oliver were once close, but that your relationship had soured. How far did that bitterness go? Elise's lips curled into a bitter smile. You think I killed him, don't you? You think that because I hated him, I must have been the one to slip poison into his wine. Price said nothing, waiting for her to continue. Elise sighed, turning her gaze back to the mirror. I won't deny that I hated him, Inspector. He was a cruel, selfish man, and he took everything from me, my career, my dignity. But murder, that's not in my nature. Perhaps, Price said carefully, but you had access to the props and you knew Oliver's habits. You would have known exactly how and when to poison him without arousing suspicion. Her eyes flickered with anger, but she quickly regained her composure. You think I would stoop so low? Poison is the weapon of the cowardly, Inspector. If I had wanted to ruin Oliver, I would have done it publicly, on the stage where everyone could see. I wouldn't have hidden behind a goblet of wine. Price watched her closely, searching for any cracks in her calm facade. There was truth in her words, but it didn't mean she wasn't involved. Elise was a skilled actress, capable of playing any role convincingly, even the role of the innocent victim. Then who, he asked, who had the most to gain from Oliver's death? For a moment, Elise hesitated, her eyes narrowing. If you want to know who had the most to gain, look no further than Abigail Trent. Abigail, Price repeated, surprised by the accusation. Elise nodded, her expression hardening. She may seem innocent, but she's ambitious. Too ambitious. She's been waiting for her chance to step into the spotlight, and Oliver's death gave her exactly that. She knew that with him out of the way, she would have her moment to shine. Price considered this carefully. Abigail Trent had seemed genuinely frightened when they spoke earlier, but ambition could drive people to do desperate things. I'll need to speak with Abigail again, he said, rising from his chair. Thank you, Madame Dupont. Inspector Price found Abigail Trent near the stage. When she saw Price approaching, her eyes widened with fear. Inspector, she said, her voice shaking. Have you found anything? Do you know who killed Oliver? Price studied her for a moment. I'm still gathering information, but I need to ask you something, Abigail. Madame Dupont suggested that you had the most to gain from Oliver's death. Is that true? Abigail's eyes filled with shock, and she shook her head frantically. No, that's not true. I never wanted Oliver to die. Yes, I wanted my chance on stage, but not like this. I admired him. He was everything I wanted to be. But he was also in your way, Price said. With him gone, you could take the lead role. Isn't that what you wanted? Abigail's lip quivered as she looked up at Price, her fear palpable. I would never hurt him, never. I wanted to be like him, but I didn't want to kill him. Was she truly innocent, or was she simply an excellent actress, just like Elise? Price wondered. Stay here, he said finally. I may need to speak with you again. Chapter 5. Elise's Secret. The inspector had spoken with Henry Groves, Madame Elise Dupont, and Abigail Trent, but none of their stories seemed to fully add up. The theatre had become a house of lies, and everyone was playing a part. His focus kept returning to Madame Elise Dupont. Something about her demeanor, so poised yet so brittle, made him believe there was more she wasn't saying. She had been the star once, until Oliver Darrow swept in and stole the limelight, relegating her to secondary roles. It was a classic case of a fall from grace, but the bitterness Elise harbored seemed to run deeper than just professional rivalry. Price had seen it in her eyes, the flicker of something unresolved, something darker. He needed to push her further. He headed toward her dressing room and knocked twice on the door, hearing a soft rustle inside before Madame Dupont answered. She stood near the mirror, her back straight. "Inspector Price," she said, her voice weary. "You've returned. Have you come to accuse me of murder again?" Price stepped into the room and closed the door gently behind him. "No accusations yet, madame, but I believe there's more you haven't told me. This isn't just about a professional rivalry with Oliver, is it? I need you to be completely honest with me." "I've told you what you need to know, Inspector," she said, her voice faltering. "Oliver was a narcissist, a man who used others to climb to the top. I was one of many who suffered because of him, but I wouldn't murder him." He took a step closer, his gaze unwavering. Perhaps not out of mere resentment, but what if there was something more? "I think you had more reason than you're letting on. Was there something Oliver held over you, something he threatened to expose?" Elise's body went rigid at the mention of a secret, and Price knew he had struck a nerve. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice thin, a crack forming in her armor. "Earlier," Price continued, keeping his voice calm, "you mentioned that Oliver manipulated people. You said he used you. I believe you were involved in something that Oliver threatened to expose, something that would have ruined you, not just your career, but your entire reputation. Am I right?" For a long moment, Elise said nothing. She stared at Price, her eyes wide with fear, but also with the anger of someone cornered. Then, slowly, she sank into the chair by the vanity, her hands trembling as they rested on her lap. "It's true," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "There is something." Elise inhaled deeply, her eyes darkening. "Years ago, when I was still the leading lady of the theatre, I made a mistake. A relationship with a man in a position of power. He was a prominent politician, and it was meant to be a fleeting affair, nothing more. But when it ended, rumors began to circulate, and I feared for my reputation. If the scandal became public, my career would have been over." "And Oliver found out," Price guessed. Elise nodded. "Yes. Oliver discovered the truth. I don't know how, but he knew everything. He threatened to expose me if I didn't do what he wanted. At first it was small things, taking lesser roles, letting him have his way in the theatre. But then, he wanted more." "What do you mean, more?" Price asked. Elise's eyes filled with tears, though she blinked them away quickly. "He wanted money. He knew the scandal would destroy me, so he blackmailed me. I paid him off once, hoping it would end there. But Oliver was never satisfied. He kept demanding more, and I couldn't stop him." Price took a deep breath, understanding now why Elise had remained so composed. Her survival had depended on it. But he wasn't yet convinced she hadn't taken matters into her own hands when Oliver pushed her too far. "Did you ever consider stopping him?" Price asked quietly. "By any means necessary?" Elise's head snapped up, and for a moment Price saw a flash of defiance in her eyes. "I thought about it," she admitted. "I thought about how much easier it would be if he were gone. But I couldn't do it. As much as I hated him, I couldn't bring myself to kill him. I'm not a murderer, Inspector. I've spent my whole life on the stage, playing roles, but I couldn't play that one." Price studied her carefully. There was pain in her confession, and her bitterness toward Oliver ran deep. But there was also a strange honesty to her that made him believe she wasn't the killer. At least not yet. "Who else knew about this?" Price asked, his tone still calm. "Did anyone else know about your secret or Oliver's blackmail?" Elise shook her head. "No, it was just between me and Oliver. I never told anyone." Price paused, considering this. If Oliver had been blackmailing Elise, it was possible someone else had found out. Perhaps another cast member or someone in the theatre. If so, they could have used that knowledge to frame Elise or to gain something for themselves. But if Elise was telling the truth, then it meant someone else had more to gain from Oliver's death than just revenge. "Thank you for your honesty, Madame Dupont," Price said finally. "I'll need to speak with the others, but I appreciate you coming forward." Elise nodded, but her eyes were distant, as though she were already lost in the memories of her past. Price's next target was Sir Reginald Fordham, the theatre's patron, and a man who had his own complicated history with both Oliver and Elise. Price found Sir Reginald pacing near the stage, his face flushed with anxiety. "Inspector," Sir Reginald greeted, his voice shaky. "What can I do for you?" "I need to ask you about your relationship with Oliver Darrow. You were seen arguing with him recently. What was that about?" Sir Reginald's expression darkened, and he glanced away. "It's true, we had a disagreement. Oliver was becoming increasingly difficult to work with. He was demanding more control over the theatre's productions, and I couldn't allow that. I have responsibilities, Inspector, both financial and personal." "What kind of personal responsibilities?" Price pressed. Sir Reginald hesitated, then sighed heavily. "I've been close to Elise for many years. She's more than just an actress to me. I've always admired her strength, her talent. When I heard what Oliver was doing to her, how he was blackmailing her, I was furious. I confronted him, told him to stop, but he just laughed in my face." "And did you ever think about doing more than confronting him?" Price asked, his tone growing sharper. "Did you ever consider taking matters into your own hands to protect Elise?" Sir Reginald's eyes widened, and he took a step back. "You think I killed him?" "No, Inspector, I may have hated Oliver for what he did, but I'm no murderer. I wanted him out of the theatre, yes, but I would never resort to something so drastic." Price studied him carefully, noting the defensive posture and the quick rise of emotion. Sir Reginald was clearly protective of Elise, but whether that protectiveness had driven him to murder remained to be seen. "Where were you during the performance?" Price asked, his voice steady. "I was in the audience watching the play," Sir Reginald replied quickly. "I stayed in my seat the entire time. Ask anyone." As Price turned to leave, Sir Reginald spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "Inspector, I didn't kill him, but I'm glad he's gone. He ruined too many lives." Price said nothing, but the weight of the words hung heavily in the air. With both Elise and Sir Reginald's statements now in hand, Price knew the investigation was beginning to shift. The pieces were starting to fit together: Oliver's manipulation, his enemies, and the growing resentment within the theatre. But there was still one more piece of the puzzle missing: the true moment when the poison was administered. Someone had tampered with that goblet, and Price was determined to find out who. The cast and crew had been close to Oliver during the performance, and at least one of them had taken advantage of the chaos to strike. The inspector's next step would be to revisit the props and trace the final moments before the poison took Oliver's life. Chapter 6: The Second Murder. As Price returned to the main auditorium, he noticed the subtle shift in the atmosphere. The audience had been dismissed, the seats now empty save for a few theatre staff who were trying to return the space to some semblance of normality. Price's thoughts were interrupted by a shout from backstage. He immediately recognized the urgency in the voice, a tone of fear and panic. His instincts kicked in, and he hurried through the wings and toward the dressing rooms, where the commotion was coming from. Bursting into the narrow hallway, he was met with a scene far worse than he had expected. Several members of the crew stood frozen in the corridor, their faces pale with shock, while one of the younger stagehands leaned against the wall, vomiting from the horror. Price pushed his way through the cluster of people, his heart sinking as he approached Elise Dupont's dressing room. There, slumped in her chair, was Madame Elise Dupont, her once glamorous figure now lifeless, her body crumpled as though the weight of her secrets had finally crushed her. A length of thick rope had been tied around her neck, the other end dangling from a hook that had been part of her dressing room's lighting rig. Her face was ashen, and her eyes stared vacantly toward the vanity mirror. At first glance, it appeared to be a suicide. The scene was eerily reminiscent of the tragic figures Elise had portrayed on stage. Women driven to despair, to the point of taking their own lives. But Price knew better. The knot was expertly tied, the kind that suggested someone else had been involved. Someone had wanted it to look like Elise had chosen this way out. He approached the body, his sharp eyes scanning the scene. There were no immediate signs of struggle, no upturned furniture or objects out of place, but the cold efficiency of the scene was unsettling. It felt too perfect, too staged. He leaned down to examine the rope around Elise's neck, noting the precision with which it had been tied. It was clear that whoever had done this was not only capable of murder, but also adept at covering their tracks. Behind him, a quiet murmur began to rise among the gathered crew members. Price turned to see Abigail Trent, her face pale and her eyes wide with terror, standing at the back of the group. She was shaking, her hands clutched tightly in front of her as she stared at Elise's lifeless body. I found her," Abigail whispered, her voice trembling. "I was going to check on her, to see if she was all right after everything that happened with Oliver. But when I opened the door, she was already like this." Price's eyes narrowed as he studied Abigail's reaction. "Abigail," Price said, his voice firm, "did you touch anything in the room before you came to get help?" Abigail shook her head frantically. "No, I didn't touch anything. I didn't know what to do. I ran to find someone. Please, Inspector, I wouldn't." Her voice trailed off as her emotions overwhelmed her, but Price remained focused. He gestured for one of the constables to escort Abigail out of the room for further questioning. There would be time later to press her on her role, if any, in this second murder. For now, Price needed to focus on the scene in front of him. This murder was clearly meant to silence Madame Dupont, to ensure that she couldn't reveal any more damaging secrets. Someone in this theatre had been afraid of what she might say. A faint rustling sound behind Price caught his attention. He turned to see Henry Groves, the playwright, hovering near the door of the dressing room, his face pale and his eyes wide with shock. "Good God," Groves muttered. "Elise, I can't believe this." Price stood up and faced the playwright. "What are you doing here, Mr. Groves?" Groves stammered, clearly shaken by the scene. I heard the commotion. I came to see what had happened. I never thought... Not Elise. First Oliver, and now her." Price watched Groves carefully, noting the genuine horror in his voice. But there was something else. Something in the way Groves kept glancing at the body, his eyes darting nervously around the room, as though he were afraid of being accused. "Did you know that Elise had a secret, Mr. Groves?" Price asked, his voice calm but probing. Groves blinked, clearly startled by the question. "A secret? What do you mean?" "She was being blackmailed by Oliver," Price said bluntly. "He knew something about her past, something that could have destroyed her reputation. She confessed it to me earlier, before she was killed." Groves's face went even paler. I didn't know," he finally managed to say. "But it makes sense. Oliver had a way of controlling people, manipulating them. He enjoyed it. Price took a step closer. And what about you, Mr. Groves? Were you manipulated by Oliver too? Groves stiffened. No, I mean, we argued, but he didn't have anything on me. He couldn't blackmail me. I would never. The playwright trailed off, clearly flustered by the line of questioning. Price watched him carefully, noting the nervous energy that radiated from the man. Groves had been on edge throughout the investigation, and while he had admitted to resenting Oliver, there was still something off about his behavior. "You've been on edge since the moment I arrived, Mr. Groves," Price said, his voice soft but cutting. "What are you afraid of?" Groves swallowed hard, his hands fidgeting at his sides. "I'm not afraid of anything, Inspector. It's just, this is all so horrible. First Oliver, now Elise. This is supposed to be a theatre, not a crime scene." Price dismissed Groves for the moment, instructing him to stay nearby. As Groves shuffled away, clearly eager to distance himself from the scene, Price turned his attention back to Elise's body. He crouched down again, this time examining her hands. There was no sign of a struggle, no defensive wounds, no sign that she had tried to fight off her attacker. The murder had been quick, efficient. It was becoming clear to Price that the killer was someone who knew how to move unseen, someone who understood the theatre's routines and could strike without drawing attention. As he rose to his feet, the door to the dressing room creaked open once more, and Sir Reginald Fordham entered, his face ashen with shock. "No," Sir Reginald's voice trembled. "Not Elise, not her—" Price stepped toward Sir Reginald, his expression hardening. "Sir Reginald, I need you to focus. Did you know Elise was in danger?" Sir Reginald met Price's eyes, his face lined with grief. "No, I didn't know. I thought she was safe after Oliver's death. I thought the nightmare was over." Price studied Sir Reginald carefully. "Someone murdered her, Sir Reginald," he said, "and I believe it's because she knew too much." "I'll need to speak with you further, Sir Reginald," Price said quietly, "but for now, I need to finish examining the scene." Sir Reginald nodded numbly and left the room, leaving Price alone with Elise's body once more. The murder had been quick and calculated, but the motive was clear. Someone had wanted to silence her before she could reveal the full extent of Oliver's manipulation. Chapter 7: A Desperate Search for Answers. Inspector Price stood alone in the dressing room where Elise Dupont's body had been found. He leaned in closer to examine Elise's body once more. The way the knot had been tied around her neck, the careful placement of the rope, it was clear this was no suicide. Someone had staged this, intending to make it look like Elise had taken her own life. The precision of the knot, the lack of a struggle, this was the work of someone who had either done this before or someone intimately familiar with the details of the theatre's backstage setup. It came down to one chilling realization. Elise had known something significant enough to get her killed. Oliver's death had set off a chain of events, and Elise had been a crucial piece in the puzzle. But now, with her gone, the investigation had taken an even darker turn. Whoever had killed her had done so to ensure her silence, and Price feared the killer may strike again. He stepped out into the corridor, where he found Abigail Trent waiting nervously. Her earlier panicked outburst had left her visibly shaken. "Inspector," she said, Do you really think someone murdered her?" Price nodded gravely. "Yes, Abigail, this was no accident. And now, more than ever, I need you to tell me the truth. I need to know if you saw anything at all, before you found Elise's body." Abigail's lips trembled as she struggled to find her voice. She clasped her hands together, wringing them nervously. "I didn't see anyone, I swear. I just went to check on her, and when I opened the door, she was already like that." Her voice cracked and tears welled up in her eyes. "I don't understand. Why would someone want to kill Elise? She wasn't dangerous, she was just—" Price took a step closer, his voice gentle but firm. Elise was involved in something much bigger than you realize. She had secrets, and those secrets made her a target. But you, Abigail, you've been around Elise, Oliver, and the rest of the cast long enough to notice things. I need you to think. Did anyone act strange tonight? Did anyone have a reason to kill both Oliver and Elise? Abigail sniffed, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand as she thought. I don't know. Everything has been so tense lately. After Oliver's death, people have been acting different, especially Sir Reginald. He seemed so angry before the show, like he was fighting with someone. Fighting? Price looked up. With whom? Abigail hesitated. I don't know for sure, but I saw him talking to Henry Groves earlier, just before the show. They were arguing about something serious. I didn't hear much, but Sir Reginald seemed furious. Price's mind raced. Sir Reginald Fordham had been present during both murders, and his relationship with Elise was more than just professional. He had admitted to confronting Oliver about the blackmail, but had he done more than just confront him? And what about Henry Groves? Could the argument Abigail had overheard be related to the killings? Thank you, Abigail, Price said. You've been helpful. As Abigail left the corridor, Price knew his next step was clear. He had to speak to Sir Reginald and Henry Groves immediately. Time was running out, and the killer was getting more desperate with each passing hour. He found Sir Reginald Fordham standing near the stage, his face drawn and tense. When he saw Price approaching, he stopped, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. Inspector, Sir Reginald began, his voice low and strained. About Elise, it's unimaginable. Price didn't bother with pleasantries. Sir Reginald, I need to know what you were arguing about with Henry Groves earlier tonight. Abigail saw the two of you in a heated exchange before the show. What was it about? Sir Reginald's eyes widened in surprise, and for a moment he seemed taken aback by the question. Then, slowly, he exhaled and ran a hand through his thinning hair. Yes, we had an argument. Henry was upset with the direction Oliver was taking the production. He felt that Oliver was undermining his authority as the playwright, and frankly, I agreed with him. Oliver had become unbearable to work with. So you argued with Groves about Oliver? Price pressed, narrowing his eyes. That's all? Sir Reginald hesitated, his gaze darting to the floor. No, not exactly. Henry and we both had reasons to want Oliver gone, but I swear to you, Inspector, I never wanted this. I never wanted anyone to die. Price studied Sir Reginald closely, noting the way his hands trembled as he spoke. There was fear in his voice, but not the kind that comes from guilt. More the kind that comes from being trapped in a situation spiraling out of control. Did you kill Oliver? Price asked bluntly, watching for any flicker of reaction. Sir Reginald's face paled, and he shook his head quickly. No, I confronted him, yes. I threatened to expose what he was doing to Elise, but I never laid a hand on him. I didn't kill him, Inspector. Sir Reginald's eyes filled with grief as he replied. I knew she was in trouble, but I didn't know the full extent of it. If I had known, I would have done anything to help her, but I didn't kill her. I couldn't. I loved her. The anguish in the patron's voice was palpable. You had the means and the opportunity, Sir Reginald. You could have easily arranged Elise's murder to make it look like a suicide. And you were close enough to Oliver to poison him. Sir Reginald looked at Price with haunted eyes, shaking his head. Because I didn't do it. I may have hated Oliver, and I may have been willing to protect Elise from his cruelty, but I'm no killer. You have to believe me. Price's instinct told him that Sir Reginald was telling the truth, or at least, he believed he was. But someone had killed both Oliver and Elise, and Sir Reginald had been deeply involved in their lives. I'll need to speak with Henry Groves next, Price said. Stay where I can find you. Sir Reginald nodded numbly as Price walked away. Henry Groves was pacing in the theatre's rehearsal room when he saw Price. Inspector, Groves stammered, his voice shaky. This is madness. First Oliver, now her. What's happening? Price wasted no time. You tell me, Mr. Groves, what were you and Sir Reginald arguing about earlier tonight? Groves swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously around the room. We argued about Oliver. He was taking over everything, rewriting my work, ignoring my direction. It was infuriating, but we also argued about Elise. Elise? Price raised an eyebrow. What about her? Groves hesitated. Reginald was obsessed with her. He wanted to protect her from Oliver, but I warned him that getting involved with her would only lead to trouble. Elise was complicated. She had a way of drawing people in and using them, just like Oliver. I told Reginald he needed to distance himself from her, but he wouldn't listen. And you? Price asked. Did you feel the same way about Elise? Groves shook his head quickly. No, I didn't hate her. I pitied her in a way. She was trapped in this world, just like the rest of us. But I didn't kill her, Inspector. Price watched Groves carefully, sensing the man's fear but also his desperation. You had access to the props, Price said, his voice measured. You could have easily tampered with the goblet that Oliver used during the performance. And you were backstage when Elise was killed. Why should I believe you're innocent? Groves looked at Price, his eyes wide with terror. Because I didn't do it. I'm not a killer, Inspector. I may have hated what Oliver did to my work, but I would never take a life. And Elise, she was already broken. I couldn't have done that to her. Price stood in silence for a long moment. The playwright was clearly on edge. I'll be watching you closely, Mr. Groves, Price said, his tone firm. Don't leave the theatre. There was something that nagged at Price. There was a final piece missing, a motive that tied everything together. Why had Elise been killed now after Oliver's death? What had she known that made her a target? And then it struck him. The blackmail. Elise had been paying Oliver to keep a secret, but what if the secret hadn't died with him? What if someone else had found out about the affair, the money, the manipulation? Chapter 8. The final curtain rises. With the truth closing in, Price pieced together the events of the night. Elise's murder had been an act of desperation, a final attempt to silence her before she could reveal the truth. But what was the truth she had uncovered, and who had the most to lose by keeping it buried? As he made his way to the small office near the back of the theatre where Sir Reginald Fordham waited, Price reviewed the facts in his mind. Sir Reginald had admitted to confronting Oliver about the blackmail, and it was clear he had a complicated, protective relationship with Elise. But his denials, though fervent, had left Price unconvinced. There was still a question about Sir Reginald's role in the tragedy. Had he been protecting Elise from the beginning, or had his love for her driven him to a darker, deadlier path? Pushing open the door to the office, Price found Sir Reginald sitting at a small desk, his head in his hands. He looked up sharply as Price entered, his eyes red and his face drawn with exhaustion and grief. "Inspector," Sir Reginald said, his voice hoarse. "Have you found the murderer? Please, tell me you've caught them." Price remained standing, his arms crossed. He studied Sir Reginald for a long moment before speaking. "I believe I'm close, Sir Reginald. But before I can make an arrest, I need you to tell me the full truth about your involvement with Elise. You loved her, that much is clear. But how far were you willing to go to protect her?" Sir Reginald's face tightened, and he clenched his fists as he spoke. "I would have done anything for Elise, anything to protect her from Oliver. But I didn't kill her, Inspector. After Oliver's death, I thought the nightmare was over. But someone else must have been afraid of what Elise knew." Price narrowed his eyes, watching for any flicker of deception. "Afraid of what exactly? What did Elise know that made her a target?" Sir Reginald looked away, shaking his head slowly. "I don't know. She never told me the details. But I knew she was hiding something important. I tried to get her to open up, but she was too afraid. Whatever it was, it must have been bigger than just the blackmail." Price's suspicions grew as he listened. Sir Reginald's grief seemed genuine. But there was something he wasn't admitting, something critical. Did Elise ever mention anyone else who might have known about her past with Oliver? Price asked. Sir Reginald shook his head. No, she kept it all to herself. Priest nodded slowly, filling Sir Reginald's answers away as he prepared for his next step. He didn't have enough to arrest Sir Reginald, but he was closing in. There was one more person he needed to confront, one more player who had been hovering in the background, keeping just enough distance to avoid suspicion. As Price left the office, his next destination was Henry Groves. The playwright had been an anxious, jittery presence throughout the night, but Price had sensed that Groves was hiding more than just nerves. His strained relationship with Oliver had been obvious, but the playwright's connection to Elise had raised new questions in Price's mind. If Groves had been close enough to both victims to know their secrets, then he could have easily used that knowledge to his advantage. Price found Groves pacing in the rehearsal room, his hands wringing together in agitation. When the inspector entered, Groves stopped and looked up, his face pale and slick with sweat. "Inspector, please," Groves stammered. "I've told you everything I know. I didn't kill them." Price remained silent for a moment, watching Groves carefully. "Mr. Groves, you were present during both murders, and you've had ample opportunity to tamper with the props, the goblet. You've admitted to arguing with both Oliver and Sir Reginald, and you were close to Elise, whether you want to admit it or not." Groves's face went white and he took a step back, his eyes widening in fear. "No, I wasn't. I mean, yes, we had our disagreements, but I wasn't close to Elise. She was Reginald's problem, not mine." Price leaned forward, his voice calm but commanding. "Stop lying, Groves. You were involved, whether directly or not. You had motive. Oliver was destroying your work, and Elise was part of the mess. If anyone had a reason to clean things up, it was you." Groves's hands began to shake violently, and his breathing grew ragged. No, I didn't. I couldn't." Price watched the man closely, waiting for the confession he knew was about to come. But just as Groves opened his mouth to speak, there was a sudden sound. Footsteps, rapid and deliberate, approaching the rehearsal room. Price turned just in time to see Abigail Trent burst into the room, her face pale but filled with determination. "Inspector," Abigail said breathlessly, "I need to tell you something I should have said earlier." Price motioned for her to continue, his attention fully on her now. "I saw something tonight," Abigail continued, her voice trembling. "Something I didn't understand at first, but now I know. It's about Henry, about the argument he had with Sir Reginald." Groves's face turned a sickly shade of grey and he stammered, No, don't." Abigail took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "Before the show, I overheard them talking about Elise. Henry said that Elise had gotten too close, that she knew too much about what really happened to Oliver. Sir Reginald was trying to calm him down, but Henry was panicking. He said something about how they couldn't let her talk." Price's eyes widened as the pieces of the puzzle finally clicked into place. Groves's nervous behavior, his paranoia, the argument with Sir Reginald, it all made sense now. "Groves," Price said, his voice low and filled with authority, "you were involved in both murders. You poisoned Oliver, didn't you? You hated him for taking control of your play. And when you found out that Elise knew, you couldn't risk her revealing the truth." Groves's body trembled violently, his face contorting with fear and guilt. "I didn't mean to. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. I just wanted it to stop. Oliver was ruining everything. My work, my reputation. And then Elise. She found out, and I knew she would expose me. She would have destroyed everything." Price took a step forward, his voice cold and measured. "So you killed her. You made it look like a suicide to cover your tracks." Groves collapsed into a chair, burying his face in his hands as sobs racked his body. "I didn't want to kill her. I didn't. But I had no choice. I couldn't let her ruin me. I just wanted to get rid of Oliver. And then it all spiraled out of control." The playwright had been at the center of it all: the ambition, the resentment, the fear. He had killed Oliver to protect his work and his fragile ego, and when Elise threatened to expose the truth, he had silenced her too. "You're under arrest, Groves," Price said, his voice firm, "for the murders of Oliver Darrow and Elise DuPont." Groves didn't resist as the constables led him away, his body limp and broken with guilt. As the sun began to rise over London, the storm that had loomed over the city finally began to fade. The theatre, now empty and quiet, stood as a monument to the ambitions and secrets that had festered within its walls. As the inspector left the theatre, he felt a sense of closure, though it was tinged with sadness. The world of the stage was filled with illusion and performance, but beneath the surface, the raw emotions of jealousy, fear, and ambition had driven two people to their deaths. The final curtain had fallen, and with it, the truth had been revealed.